Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating, honestly kind of mind-bending text by an author named Bananta Das. It's called The Alchemy of Persecution and Divine Resilience. And wow, what we've got here is an extraordinary collision of ideas. We're going to explore a worldview where the totally clinical principles of operant conditioning smash right into modern technological surveillance. And all of it, it's wrapped up in this intense framework of spiritual warfare. It's dense, it's striking, and we're going to map out exactly how the author pieces these seemingly disparate worlds together. Okay, let's dive into this, because right off the bat, we're hit with something totally unexpected. You might anticipate a purely theological opening for a text about divine resilience, right? But instead, the author grounds this whole worldview in a foundational psychological equation. Stimulus plus thought equals response. That tells us right from the start that the spiritual battles we're talking about aren't just floating around in some ethereal realm. They are actively happening right inside the human mind, literally using the mechanics of human cognition. To navigate all these intense concepts, we've broken today's explainer down into 5 main parts. We'll start with the science of conditioning, then move into technology and spiritual warfare, the power of divine grace, quantum consciousness and faith, and finally, transforming destiny through prayer. So let's jump right into part 1, the science of conditioning, programming the mind. To really grasp this section, we need to put on a sort of clinical lens. The text is describing what is basically a relentless, systematic campaign of psychological persecution. Now, what's really interesting about this is how specific the author gets about the mechanics here. According to Days, the operant conditioning of a human being is driven by 4 exact variables. You've got love, fear, reward, and suggestions. Days asserts that through these 4 specific levers, human neural patterns are just being programmed, day and night. It's framed as this continuous, almost inescapable cycle of behavioral modification happening way down at a subconscious level. And the text actually takes this a step further, crossing over from the purely psychological into the physical. The author asserts that as a part of his conditioning process, chemicals are actively being administered on a daily basis. The stated purpose of these chemicals? To draw out a specific, desired response from a person and then meticulously record that behavior. So we're looking at a worldview where the human mind and body are essentially treated like subjects in this endless involuntary experiment designed to manipulate reactions. Which brings us to part 2, technology and spiritual warfare, the digital battleground. If the mind is being conditioned, the next logical question the author tackles is, well, how is it being monitored? And this brilliantly illustrates the severe power imbalance going on in this text. On one side, you have the human mind. Das describes it as becoming weak and vulnerable due to fear. And it's a very modern fear, specifically an inability to control the everyday gadgets inside your own home. Then, on the flip side, you have what the author bluntly calls Satan's evil plans. This is a dark force using this massive, oppressive, tech-driven surveillance apparatus. It's such a striking contrast, right? Human frailty inside the domestic space versus a highly calculated technological threat. The level of surveillance detailed here is honestly incredibly precise. The text claims that your actual brainwaves and eye movements are being measured and recorded with absolute precision. And these biological metrics aren't just sitting in a database somewhere. They're being actively analyzed by computers with a very specific dark goal: to predict the evil inside the human body. Everyday technology is framed here not as a convenience, but literally as a weaponized tool for spiritual profiling. Let's move on to part 3, the power of divine grace, strength in suffering. With such an intense level of vulnerability and paranoia established, you'd think things would just get darker. But the narrative actually shifts here. It pivots away from that oppressive surveillance and moves toward resilience. Central to all this is the theological framework Das relies on. The text frames this entire experience of persecution as a test from God, specifically to see if one will obey his commandments. And crucially, during this test, you are never alone or unobserved. Das outlines as 3 fundamental witnesses to our actions: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The belief that these divine figures are constantly watching provides a huge, foundational pillar of strength for the author through all these trials. Now, the text fully acknowledges that as you suffer under this conditioning and surveillance, your physical immunity and strength are inevitably going to decrease. It takes a toll, but it emphasizes this incredibly powerful counterbalance. As your physical strength wanes, the grace and wisdom of the Holy Spirit literally flow down from heaven. This leads directly to the core message of hope in the text: there is nothing that the love of Christ can't transform. It's basically a declaration of ultimate victory over both physical and psychological deterioration. All right, part 4, quantum consciousness and faith, the higher dimension. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this is where the explainer really hits its conceptual climax. The author introduces this incredibly dense hybrid concept called quantum mechanical probability. But in the context of this source material, Dotz isn't talking about a particle physics equation. He defines it as the literal probability of traveling into a higher dimension of consciousness. And the vehicle for this dimensional travel, it's not a machine. It's actually unwavering faith in Jesus Christ. It's just a fascinating way of framing spiritual salvation, almost like an event of quantum physics triggered entirely by belief. To reach this higher dimension, though, a dualistic battle has to be fought. The text states that Satan's goal is to destroy the physical body, but the author makes a point to note that this very same body holds an incredible power, the power to actually transform its own consciousness. To protect itself and fight back, the spirit utilizes its biggest armor, and Das identifies this specifically as words and inherent attractions. So we're talking about a war fought not with physical weapons, but with spiritual resonance and spoken truth. Further blending these scientific and spiritual realms, the author looks at the very nature of reality itself. The text suggests that the world you see around you is actually an attraction, or a reflection, of your own violations of God's commandments. When God steps in to teach the soul about its mistakes, his message carries what the author calls the timestamp of a predestined response. Basically, it acts as a reveal of alternate spiritual timelines. It shows you exactly what would have happened if different actions had been taken. Which brings us to our final section, part 5, Transforming Destiny Through Prayer, the Path of Light. Having mapped out the conditioning, the technological warfare, the divine grace, and the literal quantum mechanics of faith, the source text wraps up by focusing on the ultimate practical power of human spiritual action. So the crucial point is how these concepts practically alter a person's life trajectory. The author leads out this really clear 3-step progression. Step 1, even small mistakes have a severe impact on your destiny. Step 2, active interventions, specifically prayers and love, are introduced into the equation. And step 3, because of that intervention, destiny is actively transformed. It shifts from a path of predetermined suffering right into a path of salvation. It is a deeply, deeply empowering view of spiritual agency. Now, the author doesn't downplay the reality of the persecution they perceive, not at all. The text openly admits that in this highly monitored, conditioned world, every single second is a threat. Yet, the final summary of this worldview is totally one of triumph. The idea is that with divine companionship, that paralyzing fear, the fear generated by all those technological and spiritual enemies, is completely destroyed. It allows the individual to just walk freely in the path of light. We have explored an incredibly dense landscape today, navigating everything from operant conditioning and predictive computer models all the way to quantum probabilities and divine grace. Beyond Das presents a worldview where literally every thought and action has monumental dimensional weight. And based on the mechanics of that worldview, we're left with a really powerful final thought. If even the smallest actions and prayers can actively reroute destiny from suffering to salvation, how will you choose to transform yours? Keep learning, keep questioning, and thank you so much for joining us on this explainer.